Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Adam Mockler and Hasan did a debate, actually, about this thing that has been going viral recently regarding Hasan amongst liberals, where Hasan said that he would rather vote third party than vote for Gavin Newsom over J.D. Vance. So he said that to Jennifer Welch on the I've Had It podcast, and it's been circulating ever since with a lot of establishment liberal types. They are taking it as an opportunity to dunk on Hasan, saying that he's not on the team, he is, helpful to Republicans, etc. And as I've noted, you saw less of this narrative immediately after the victory because it rang very hollow. But now that there's some momentum picking up towards the next elections, and it is now the responsibility of Democrats to figure out where they're going to go politically and what message they are going to start putting out to the public. And so there has to be this apparatus of people that are pushing back against messages like this. And so the thing about what Hasan said is that it's very potent. It's a very potent message to say, honestly, if they went with Gavin Newsom, it's pointless at that point. There's no difference, whatever exactly he said. And so Mockler is really trying to nail him in this debate on the idea that there is a distinction between Democrats and Republicans, and that distinction is meaningful. So that's his angle in this debate. And other than that, they mostly agree. They agree on most criticisms of Democrats. They agree on what Democrats should do going forward. But the case that Mockler's trying to make is that by downplaying the difference between Democrats and Republicans and claiming that it's marginal, he contributes to voter apathy. And that's why he is so demonized by people on the liberal side. And then Hasan makes his point in defense. So here's that real quick, and then I'll get into what I think of all this and who won this debate.
I guess I want to ask you, do you think it would be meaningfully easier to build this working class socialist-based movement in a liberal society or an illiberal society?
Oh, historically speaking, most likely an illiberal society. At least historically speaking, socialist and communist movements have unfortunately only been successful when material conditions have worsened. I don't want that to happen though, because I don't want to live through that, and I don't think that is like an appropriate thing to move towards. I don't think that that's good for people. I think it's very violent and very deadly. I don't want the material conditions to deteriorate. But if you're asking me, like, honestly, from a historical perspective, no,
I'm basically asking. I'm basically just asking if we get to a 2028 and like. I guess we can get into the hypothetical of Newsom versus Vance, but it's not even about that. They're kind of just stand-ins. I don't even want to concede who our nominee is going to be 2 years ahead, but I think there would be a meaningful difference in building a, pro-labor movement under a J.D. Vance presidency, which would be much, much harder, versus a Gavin Newsom presidency.
But the reality of the matter is, if you're asking me sincerely, like, do you think that Gavin Newsom is going to be better than J.D. Vance? Of course. I mean, this is not something just like Kamala Harris is objectively going to be better than Donald Trump. The miscommunication around this comes in large part due to me openly saying, like, it's out of my hands at that point, because that was the second part that I mentioned. It's openly out of my hands at that point, and there's no way for me to overcome the way that the party is communicating what they want to do. And the fact that a lot of people hear that and immediately go, oh, this guy, he wants the Republicans to win. I don't.
Can you see how people are bothered when you then go on the stream, and I'm quoting you verbatim, you said Democrats have written you out of existence, Democrats don't give a fuck about you, and then you said later on, the marginalized identities have been left behind by the Democratic Party. You're kind of drawing a false equivalency, and then that brings me back to the Jennifer Welch clip. I'm trying to give you the strongest liberal argument here as to why people are mad. It's not because
and by the way, I've heard this argument. I used to make this argument myself.
Yeah, but you said at that point it doesn't even matter, and that kind of feeds into the broader apathy that you seem to be pushing towards. So there is a meaningful difference between Democrats and Republicans on trans issues, right? If you grew up in a Democrat or a Republican state, there's a meaningful difference between your quality of life. Can you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. What I want the Democrats to do is to, one, not compromise at all when it comes to putting forth a counter messaging operation to go back and fight back against the Republican Party when it comes to trans issues. My criticisms of the Democratic Party revolve around their closeness to Republicans or their endless interest in conceding to Republicans on certain issues, because that concession doesn't actually end up causing them to win elections. The only thing it actually ends up doing is those concessions actually normalize some of the Republican agenda items in the eyes of the base of the Democratic Party.
Your strongest argument as to why Democrats are throwing them under the bus are some polls that you see on Twitter, not from Democratic Party leaders, but from like Lakshaya Jain or whatever. Some people after the 2024 election going on TV and saying something to the effect of, oh, we lost because of trans people. That's obviously bullshit. Get those people out of here. And then Gavin Newsom on Charlie Kirk's podcast. That's your evidence that the Democratic Party is throwing marginalized people or leaving marginalized people behind. I don't see it.
Okay.
And then like when you get confronted on it or when someone asks you about it, you're like, well, it's just hyperbole. It's like, no, like we shouldn't hyperbolize about trans people, how one party treats trans people versus another when there is a meaningful difference. A lot of the criticism I saw on Twitter goes back to the conversation that I was kind of trying to like, not pin you down, but I was kind of trying to return to it over and over is the way that you word these things on your stream. I genuinely think liberals take problem with that.
The plurality doesn't vote, and therefore the plurality is apathetic, right? My audience, as I've demonstrated already, is not apathetic, and they are voting for the Democratic Party when push comes to shove.
I think the plurality would be less apathetic if we could illustrate more. I think the plurality is apathetic because people say there's a marginal difference between the parties.
Okay.
If we could illustrate.
This is a good point. So you think it's people like myself and others that are creating this apathy and not the multi-billion-dollar messaging infrastructure of the Democratic Party that is making it seem as though the differences are either completely irrelevant for them
No.
or inconsequential.
No, I think it could be both. It can be both and
I try to communicate that to the Democrats to the best of my ability. If they don't want to fucking listen, it's out of my hands. And that goes back to the same point. I want to have a conversation with Gavin Newsom. I want to communicate to Gavin Newsom what these spectacular failures look like. But if he's too busy yucking it up with fucking Steve Bannon, Charlie Kirk, Ben Shapiro, talking about how his son is a major Charlie Kirk fan, talking to Ben Shapiro and apologizing to Ben Shapiro on Israel not being a genocide, or apologizing to Ben Shapiro about what his like social media team said about ICE.
I don't run Gavin Newsom's podcast strategy.
Mockler did a pretty good job in this argument, except for the fact that he has less of a vision in terms of what he is encouraging Democrats to do, what politics should look like. So I think the place that he has Hasan is that Hasan does exaggerate a lot, and he tends to word things in a way that is, as I've put it, kind of designed to get him in trouble. I don't necessarily think he does it on purpose, but I think as a combination of the fact that he talks on stream a lot and that streaming favors saying things that are a little bit boisterous, exaggerative, being entertaining. And not only that, but the fact that he is actually trying to push hard against the Democratic Party. Whereas someone like Mockler might voice his criticisms, even has much larger of a voice within the Democratic Party ranks, but also isn't pushing quite as hard. And the nature of what Hasan is saying by saying, I'd probably rather vote third party, even voicing that opinion as somebody who has a large impact, is putting some genuine political pressure on the Democratic Party, which is why there's so much pushback to it. So the way he lays out his argument in this conversation, he's not really defending the idea of voting third party over Democrats. That's not ultimately what they end up talking about here. What they are talking about is whether or not there's a meaningful distinction between the policy of Democrats and Republicans. And then later, Hasan is able to shift the conversation to if there's voter apathy about whether Democrats are different from Republicans, is that Hasan's fault or is that the Democrats' fault? So that's really the substance of Hasan's argument, and I think that's where he's correct. But Mockler's correct that when he pushes Hasan on it, if Hasan is not outright saying Democrats are literally no different than Republicans, then it doesn't really make that much sense to say that you would vote third party over Republican. And, the part that also didn't get mentioned here is, like I've said and Sam Cedar said, Hasan is in California, so it doesn't really matter who he votes for. And he could say that here too. He could say, I didn't tell people on my stream not to vote for Kamala Harris. I refuse to endorse her, but I also made it clear that even these minor distinctions between the parties at a macro level make a huge difference in many people's lives. But the problem is that that minor difference is no longer good enough for Democrats to brand themselves differently than Republicans. And on top of that, the Democratic brand has been subject to a lot of rot that has taken place in the last several years, partially because of Donald Trump and people like him undermining people's faith in institutions in general, but also this point that they agree on that Democrats don't seem to offer any real policy. And so the thing is about what Hasan's saying about this third party thing is that it is the perfect time to be saying that. Right now is exactly when Hasan should be saying exactly that. It makes perfect sense to say what he's saying right now. If it was right before a midterm election or a general election, whatever, then you could make the argument that it's more harmful. And, Hasan already has attracted the ire of many people on the liberal side because of the fact that he, isn't just willing to endorse Democrats or cape for Democrats as a default position. And while Mockler, I think, is correct in saying that the more justifiable version of the liberal argument against Hasan is that downplaying the difference between Republicans and Democrats is dangerous, because even if we would only be in a marginally different place right now in terms of policy, if Democrats were in charge, that would still make a big difference in many people's lives, like the many, many people that have died because of USAID cuts and other things. There's a meaningful difference. So I think that's true. But it's also true that the liberal pushback that has been triggered by what Hasan is saying here is meaningfully harmful and deliberately designed to prevent the party from moving further left. So when this many people get upset, not just at the idea that Hasan said he doesn't support Gavin Newsom or wouldn't like voting for him, but specifically says, if you put Gavin Newsom up in the general, I would rather vote third party. That's a strong statement. It's more of a feeling than it is a statement that Hasan justifies through and through. Like I said, he's not sitting here having a 2-hour conversation justifying voting third party. That's not what he's talking about. But the outrage that has been triggered by him suggesting that he might is specifically for the purpose of making it so that Democrats do not have to listen to the demands of people saying things like that, which is a sizable portion of voters that voted third party instead of voting for Democrats in the 2024 election. So that's part of the problem here. And if it's true that Hasan, contributes to apathy on the part of voting when he says things like that, despite the fact that he also does go on at length describing things in more accurate detail, although I will say that some of his statements that he just throws out there can be provocative sometimes. It is just as harmful, if not more so, when you have this establishment-funded pushback, let's be honest, against someone who is really making a reasonable criticism of the party and also voicing what a lot of voters feel. And that is the peril that Democrats are walking into if they want to keep demonizing people like Hasan, because Hasan's policy demands are not extreme. He's only an extremist because he's willing to say, I'm not enough of a Democratic loyalist that I wouldn't vote third party, especially if you put up a corporatist like Gavin Newsom. That and some edgy comments that he's made is really the most extreme thing about Hasan. So if Gavin Newsom is willing to talk to literally Steve Bannon, one of the most extreme people on the right, but he won't talk to Hasan Piker, especially in the aftermath of that comment, which has made it one of the most prominent conversations in liberal politics. I don't know why you wouldn't talk to Hasan Piker at this point. It seems like that's probably inevitable if this conversation keeps going like this. And yeah, I mean, I can understand people being reactive to things that Hasan says. I think sometimes when he's on the spot, when he says something quickly, is when he says things that get him in trouble versus when he explains his thought process at length. Usually it's pretty unobjectionable. So, I think it's a product of what he does, and it leads to plenty of reasonable criticism. But ultimately, the reaction to what he said is just as much what paralyzes and imperils the Democratic Party as what Hasan is doing, which is basically just voicing the opinion of people out there who already don't vote for Democrats. But they're gettable. They're gettable voters. But they don't perceive there to be a meaningful difference between the parties. And that is because American politics has coalesced around essentially a version of neoliberalism that keeps the corporate and business class happy. So that's what people are referring to when they say there's no difference between Democrats and Republicans, because ultimately politicians in power continue to serve those interests. Even Donald Trump ran against it. And the only positive thing that people were able to say about this going into it was, well, maybe he's not going to serve those interests. People that were naive said that. And what do you know? He's serving the same interests. The war machine, Israel, business class. He says he's not going to try to bring housing prices down. Why? Because it's going to hurt the wealth of people who already own houses. That's how the whole game works. And it's likely that Kamala Harris's policy when it comes to those things would have been similar. And so when you see the excesses, the negative excesses of Trump-style policy, we see what ICE has done, leading to the murder of multiple people on America's streets, not to mention the mistreatment of thousands of migrants so far. Who knows how bad it's going to get from here, especially if they're trying to operate more under the radar. We see what he's trying to do in Iran, launching a war supposedly to get Iran to make some kind of nuclear deal, which they had already made, by the way, that Trump tore up in his first term. So that has led to all of this. And you could argue that the only reason, and even Barack Obama made the same argument, that the only reason Trump had an opening to do that is because the solutions instituted by liberals when they had power were not strong enough. And so Donald Trump is able to come in, tear up the nuclear deal, cause years of turmoil in the region, back and forth about whether Donald Trump specifically is going to go to war with Iran, not to mention the instability between Israel and Iran, again, circulating from this idea that they're going to get nuclear weapons. Supposedly, that's the justification. And so now Trump is using that as justification to potentially start another war with Iran. So I don't know if that's going to happen, because this has been a boogeyman of Trump's for a while. He seems to like to do this when it comes to Iran. He wants to threaten them, and he wants everybody to believe him when he is on the edge of making these threats. So it doesn't mean he's not going to do it. But to me, what it means is that whoever takes power from Trump is going to be inheriting the infrastructure that he has either created or destroyed during his time. And that's why it's very important that the person who inherits that infrastructure is somebody who has a real vision and who ran on real policies about where to take American politics. Because even Adam Mockler, I was surprised to hear in this conversation, he says as a boilerplate position that ICE should be abolished. So even among many liberals like Adam Mockler, the understanding has solidified that ICE needs to be abolished. They might moderate on that issue if somebody like Gavin Newsom ends up being their figurehead, which, to be fair to Adam Mockler, he is not saying that he's a huge fan of Gavin Newsom and he's going to go along with whatever Gavin Newsom says. But he is taking it for granted that he would vote for Gavin Newsom over J.D. Vance. And again, 2 weeks before an election, it makes sense to draw that distinction. Right now, making the case that Gavin Newsom is meaningfully different than J.D. Vance, I think is actually the wrong thing to be saying. Because if you don't want somebody like Gavin Newsom to be the one who inherits the destruction and the destructive capacity that Donald Trump is currently building up, then you should do everything that you can to make sure that people view Gavin Newsom as essentially a Republican. That is what is going to help make it so that whoever takes power from Trump is someone who can actually tackle these problems. Someone who's not afraid to run on abolish ICE, someone who's not afraid to run on cutting off aid to Israel, or even conditioning aid to Israel, which very few American politicians are willing to say, or something like Medicare for all. And so continuing to argue about the marginal differences between these candidates is what has allowed Republicans to run away with the American discourse. And right now is an opportunity for Democrats to get really creative about what it is that they want to do. Americans, I think, are hungry for all kinds of solutions and policy. And I think America could truly be transformed with the type of technology that is just starting to rear its head. But it has to be somebody who has more vision than somebody like Gavin Newsom, who, again, he's willing to talk to Charlie Kirk, he's willing to talk to Steve Bannon, but he's not willing to talk to Hasan Piker, who speaks to a meaningful portion of the base that Democrats need to be speaking to. He would rather talk to the base of people that Steve Bannon is speaking to. So not just as an individual personality in Gavin Newsom, but as a tendency in Democrats, that should be a huge red flag. And it is absolutely valid for people to react with anger and rage at Democrats behaving that way. It is a sign that they plan to throw people like trans people and immigrants under the bus in order to win. And it's not necessary. It's a failing strategy, and it's unacceptable.
Me too close to, too much to do. The mission is too crucial. Shout it out from the rooftops until I lose vocals. Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity.